Hello, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? Yeah?
Rebonjour à tous. Juste avant de passer à notre prochain présentateur, je voulais juste faire un petit reminder. Vous pouvez prendre les escaliers, il y en a une à gauche, à droite, puis tous les villages sont là, donc IoT, Bitcoin, ce genre de trucs-là. Donc, n'hésitez pas à aller vous promener, à aller faire le tour, c'est vraiment nice. So, for the next speaker, I'm presenting you Alex. So, Alex, stage is up to you.
Thank you. Good morning. So today I'm giving a talk called You Won't Own Passwords and You'll Like It. A little bit about myself. I'm the technical director of the offensive security group at Kroll, formerly Security Compass Advisory. Basically, we're a big pen testing shop, red teaming as well. And my role is really helping us develop our technology, our approaches, and the service capabilities for our large group of pen testers. Previously, I also did vuln research, reversing exploits, all kinds of fun stuff. So my motivations today and why I really want to do this talk is we've done a lot of work in preparing for passkeys. So our pen testers, our consultants are able to properly assess this technology in the future. That involves both specific checks, how to think about them, and kind of the bigger picture, the attack surface of how you can go about attacking them. So we built some tools. I'll talk about that later, as well as we're really just going to look at the attack surface today, how you think about attacking passkeys and passwordless authentication. And the main reason is authentication is a super critical security control. Everyone here knows that. And we need our pen testing group to be fully prepared to handle this in the future. So that's really why I came about this. And I'm a big fan of the technology. I think Passkeys is going to be a huge step forward security-wise, and I'll tell you all the reasons why. So just a quick outline of what we're covering. Why passwords suck, what are Passkeys, Passkeys attack surface, and finally some tooling that I've created and publicly releasing to help pen test Passkeys. So why passwords suck? I mean, we just had a great talk about all the passwords you can find all over the dark net. 86% of breaches involve stolen credentials. You know, there's all kinds of scare stats about why passwords are terrible. Everyone kind of knows this is true at this point. They are almost always responsible in any sort of significant breach. They are commonly an initial entry vector, but they're also an important step for lateral movement or privilege escalation. Anytime it's happening within a breach, stolen credentials are almost always some factor in it. Attackers love it because they work. They're super effective. As a pen tester or offensive security professional, you start thinking of all the techniques that are in your toolkit that really are meant to attack passwords. You know, password spraying, credential stuffing, hash cracking, dictionary attacks, brute force, phishing, rainbow tables, password, reset logon flows, keyloggers, shoulder surfing. You know, those all attack passwords, and they're all pretty effective. And users struggle with passwords as well. As passwords have evolved, security requirements have increased, passwords have become less and less usable, which make it harder and harder for users. And you know, there's kind of the corollary there that less technically capable users are more vulnerable because maintaining good password hygiene is hard. It takes effort, it takes knowledge. Things like password rotation, password complexity, ensuring you aren't reusing passwords, using a password manager and using it correctly, as well as just dealing with multi-factor authentication, which is now an additional step on top of passwords. So we know the passwords suck, but why is passkeys the right solution or a good solution to move forward? So passkeys are passwordless authentication, and they're built off established standards. It builds off WebAuthN, it builds off FIDO. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But because it's built on established standards, the security and trust of this technology has already been established to some degree. So it's already proven to be relatively secure. A big thing with previous technology in this area was it was a single point of failure. So if you had a security key and you lost that security key, well, burn your account, create a new one because you can't get back in. With passkeys, there's redundancy and synchronization so that you don't have that single point of failure. Passkeys are based off public key cryptography. So when the breaches do inevitably happen, the servers that get breached, the companies that get breached, they don't have your authentication secrets. They can't leak your information, so it does not any further compromise users. One of the big strengths of passkeys and FIDO as well, it's phishing resistant. You know, you could say it's even impossible to phish, but I never say impossible. But it's really damn hard to phish passkeys. So yeah, it's a super, super strong quality there. And then the biggest thing, which kind of addresses the weaknesses of passwords, is usability. Passkeys are simple to use. It's a very intuitive, straightforward interface. You visually select the account you want to log in with. You provide typically a biometric authentication on your phone, you know, your fingerprint, your passkey, your passcode for your phone, however you log into your phone, and that's it. You log in transparently. And the cross-device authentication flows just make all those corner use cases a lot easier as well. And the other big reason why passkeys, I think, are one of the big technologies that is actually going to make the impact is because it's been adopted by the major vendors. Google, Apple, Microsoft, as part of the FIDO Alliance, have all agreed on how to implement the consistent standards across technologies. So that means almost all modern devices are going to be passkeys capable. They'll have this built in. You'll be able to use it relatively easily. And they provide a couple other features, which we'll mention as well. So what are passkeys? As I said, it's built on established technology, and there's a bunch of these pieces that are all kind of fit into it. So let's just clarify a few of the different pieces here. So FIDO2 is essentially the whole picture. It's all the pieces that are involved. It's WebAuthN plus UAF. WebAuthN is the API. It's the communication between your browser or the client, as well as the authenticating servers, as well as the API exposed by your browser or mobile OS to kick off the authentication ceremony. So WebAuthN has already been established and been around for a while, but Passkeys uses that protocol, that API, and builds the additional structure around it. UAF is the Universal Authentication Framework. This is really the platform that exposes the WebAuthN API. So this would be in a browser or in a mobile operating system. And then it provides the user interface, the dialogues for the user to choose their accounts, and then the logic behind choosing and communicating with the authenticator that you want to use. So it's the platform is the implementation by the major vendors that really makes this work. U2F or CTAP1, probably a lot of you are familiar with this protocol. This is an older version of it, the Universal Second Factor Authentication Protocol. So this is with your USB security keys to log in, almost always as a second factor. So that was the communication protocol between your browser and the keys to perform that second factor authentication. CTAP2 is just the evolution of that protocol. It supports more types of authenticators, different transport mechanisms, as well as internal authenticators. And that is still how the U2F platform communicates with the different authenticators. But then the piece that really makes Passkeys is the support from the major vendors. So it's their implementation of the UAF framework, kind of that platform piece, as well as one of the key features here is account-based synchronization. So the Apple and Google in particular, they take your passkeys, they encrypt them, and they will synchronize them across your devices. This gets rid of that single point of failure, which was such a problem with U2F keys and the original kind of security keys. So this means if you lose your phone, falls in a lake, you can still get a new phone, sign into your account, and your passkeys will get synced down with your Google or Apple account, and you'll still have access to all your accounts. So it eliminates that single point of failure. Microsoft has also done some implementation around this. They don't have the syncing capability, but on their OS they support browsers, Chrome, Android, Firefox. They all work on Microsoft platforms with OS support and integrated into Windows Hello. So Passkeys WebAuthN, there's really two actions here. Create a passkey credential and authenticate with a passkey credential. So the first one is to create a passkey credential. To create a credential, you first need to verify your user. This can come around a few different ways. A lot of times it would just be a standard new user verification flow like you typically see on applications. So send an email to your email account, click on a link to verify your identity. If you're bootstrapping an existing system and migrating from passwords to passkeys, this would often be based off your existing login. So have a user log in with their password and then prompt them to create a passkey. With the password, they've already verified the user. You've got a bootstrapping point for passkeys. There's also the cross-device authentication flow. So if you're on one device, you can move to a different device through passkeys and then create a passkey on that device. So you now have two sets of credentials, but both log you into the same account, and it's really straightforward. The call is very simple, as exposed in JavaScript APIs and browsers. Navigator.credentials.create. It's a pretty straightforward call, and that invokes the UAF platform, which will kick off the authenticator choices, the UI that's provided. And once you have successfully created a credential, you return the call object back to the server that created it. This includes the public key, so of course that they will be able to verify your authentication in the future, credential ID, and as well as a signed assertion showing the use of those credentials. So this is what the create credential call looks like. We'll just kind of briefly go through all these fields because we're going to talk about attacking them later on. So having the background of what they are is kind of important. First, RP is the relaying party. This is Passkeys WebAuthN language for the web server, the client you're talking to. It's called the relaying party because typically you are pulling in scripts in the website, which you're running locally on your browser, and is relaying the call to the authenticator module. But this is just the site you're authenticating to. You'll also note here in the creation, you've got two forms of ID. You have a name as well as an ID. Later on, it only uses the ID. So make note of the difference between the two. Next, there's the user. So this is how we identify the user that we are authenticating. This information is stored with the credential in the authenticator when it's created. Again, note there's a couple different fields within the user object. You've got the name and the display name, so those can be a little different, and the ID. The ID is not a name or personally identifiable information like an email address. We'll talk about some attacks there later. The challenge, this is the authentication challenge. It's 32-bit or sometimes smaller. random string. This is what gets signed to demonstrate the use or the availability that you have possession of the private key. When you're creating a public key credential, you need to agree on what type of public key credentials you're going to create. So the relaying party sends the public key cred params object, which is a list of public key algorithms that are accepted. This is based off an IANA registry of algorithm types. So you've got the identifiers here with numbers, -7, -250, 257. There's a whole list of them. But it's an ordered list that lists what type of algorithms the relaying party prefers in order. So the authenticator will start at the top of the list, and as soon as it finds one it supports, it'll probably create the credential with that type. Exclude credentials is a field that is available to basically avoid duplication if you're creating a credential. So if you already have an existing credential on advice, you can say, okay, we don't want to create a second of the same credential. It can also be used in some other scenarios if you're migrating from an older form to current passkeys, but yeah. Resident key basically means a discoverable client-side credential, which is what we think of as passkeys. Older forms of FIDO and WebAuthN supported non-discoverable credentials, which were server-side stored credentials. Basically, all passkeys and modern implementations of this are going to specify resident key, which means a discoverable credential. And then the last one, which is interesting, is user verification. So this is the verification level that is going to be associated with that credential. Does the server require that user verification is used every single time that that credential is used? The other operation provided by passkeys is, of course, authenticate. This is what you're going to be using most of the time when you use a passkey to authenticate to a server. So you start by loading, of course, the site into your browser, the app, from the server, loading the sources, and it proactively pulls in an authentication challenge. So you typically, like, if you got a UI, you think as soon as the user enters a username, before you even get to the authentication phase, it's going to pull in an authentication challenge so that it's ready to go on the authenticate side. Then you call the navigator.credentials.get. This is the JavaScript or OS supplied API that kicks off the authentication operation, which may require user verification. It'll take you through the UI to select your account and log in. Once that API call returns a response, it is returned back to the server. It includes a signed assertion, so the signed version of the challenge, as well as authenticator information so that the server can verify the authenticator type and if user verification was performed. The server has to validate the authentication, of course, ensure that it is signed, it corresponds to the public key that they believe, that they know is associated with that user account, as well as then once the authentication is verified, it issues a session cookie or API token or whatever sort of ongoing authentication mechanism is going to be used. So this is what the authentication call looks like. A little bit simpler than the create call. The challenge, of course, is one of the big fields here. This is your random string, again, that's going to be signed by the private key to prove your authentication. Timeout, oh, actually, we go slightly out of order. Relaying party, this is the other really critical piece. The credential, the public key credential in the authenticator is tied to your relaying party ID. As I mentioned earlier, you have a name and an ID. This time it only specifies the ID. That is the one that is tied to the credential. This is what provides the phishing resistance. By tying your credential to a specific relaying party, there is no way you can go to a fake domain or another domain and say, hey, this is really the bank, give me your banking credentials. It will verify that that has came from the specific domain that what created it. So that's what provides the phishing resistance. And is also an interesting point for attacking credentials. Timeout is exactly what you'd expect. The one kind of interesting bit here is the authentication flow can take a minute, especially if you're using a cross-device authentication flow. So your timeout can't be super short because it does prompt the user to go through a couple steps on the UI, typically. So the timeout has to have a little bit of time in there. User verification, same as before. Is user verification actually required? So your biometric verification. And then the allow credentials is an interesting optional field when authenticating. This can specify which credentials are allowed. For most discoverable credentials, this won't be specified, but in a couple different scenarios, this is really useful. So if you are re-authenticating, say there's a privileged operation you want to do, and you want to re-authenticate the user to validate before you allow them to do this privileged operation, this is where you might use the allow credentials to ensure that they're authenticating with the expected credentials that grant them those privileges. As well as this can also be used for non-discoverable credentials. Kind of provides a little bit of privacy, but that's not the issue. It's more just supporting an older type, so that if you can't discover the credentials, this provides the ID of the credentials to the authenticator, so you can still access them. And once the authentication is performed, this is the response that's returned that is sent back to the server to validate. Type public key, straightforward. The ID, raw ID, these two fields basically support something else. They'll always be the same here, but it's just the ID of the credential. The type of authenticator attachment, so this is basically, is it a cross-platform authenticator? So did you use like your mobile device to authenticate for your laptop, something like that? Or is it the internal authenticator? Are really the two options you're going to see there. Next is client data JSON. So this is the actual object that gets hashed during the signing algorithm and then returned back. So this is the original version, which the server is going to need the original version to compute the hash to verify it. But this is where you see the challenge gets embedded in this. So this is the hashing of the challenge for signing. You'll also notice the origin is in there and the actual call as well. And you can also add other fields in there. If you want to protect other data associated with the user account, you're free to add other user fields in here in your own implementation. Authenticator data is quite interesting. This is a CBOR encoded object. It's a pain in the butt to decode, so my tool that we'll talk about later will help you decode this. Has a couple interesting bits of information encoded in here. RP hash ID, so you're relaying party hash. That's exactly what you expect. And then there's a flags field that provides you a bit of information with the type of authentication. So there's a user verification flag, so it tells you if user verification was performed. There's the attested credentials included. Attested credential object is an optional object within this. So if that object is included, this flag will be set. Extension data. So this Passkeys does support extensions. You can see there's the extension field here. They are sometimes used, but if this flag is set, it tells your server to look at the extension data as well. And then user presence, which is always going to be true with Passkeys. It's kind of a mandatory true, but it detects that the user is physically present, or the authenticator is physically present with the authentication. And we'll mention how that's achieved, but it's through Bluetooth, essentially. Signature, exactly what you think. This is the signature which must be validated. It's got all the fun in there. User handle just represents the user ID. Again, this is the ID, which is the non-identifying version or non-personally identifying version. And client extension results. So we saw earlier within the authentication data section, there's the authentication, basically keys. This is the value that matches to the authentication, extension results. So the other big piece of password managers is the implementation by the major vendors. So Google, Apple, Microsoft. Google uses Google Password Manager to achieve backup and synchronization across your devices. So they take a copy of your passkeys and store it in their cloud, essentially. So any two Google accounts, Android accounts, Chrome devices, whatever, your passkeys, if they're signed into the same Google account, your passkeys will be synchronized across all those devices. Of course, these are always end-to-end encrypted. Google will never have access to your passkeys because it is encrypted with keys that are generated and protected on your end-user devices. Mobile devices, those are hardware-protected keys. On a laptop, maybe not hardware, but hopefully is, depending on what versions you're running. And it requires a screen lock or unlocking your device to decrypt that object which contains your secret keys. So the recovery flow here is particularly interesting, because this would, of course, would be an opportunity. If you can sign into a Google account, it could allow you to pull down passkeys and access them, but it is also tied to the sign-in of the device that created them. So the encryption key is unlocked with the sign-in code from your device. So if my phone goes in a lake, I get a new phone, sign in, I will need to sign in with my Google account, and I also need the passcode or passkey, passcode or pattern, that's the other one, for my old phone. So Google will not have access to that as well, but through a secure protocol, they will be able to determine if I have the correct key. SRP, kind of like hashing, just determines if it's valid without actually seeing the value. And critically for Google and Apple as well, this is a hardware enforced mechanism. So they've got an HSM that enforces a maximum of 10 attempts at obtaining the correct key or pattern or code to unlock the vault. So if you get a new device, maximum of 10 attempts. So if you go more than 10 attempts, your passkeys are lost and you are locked out forever. Unless you find your old device, then you can probably get back in. Apple implements a very similar process. End-to-end encrypted, requires the code for the device as well as the biometric. The one real difference here with Apple is in their verification flow. They also have an SMS verification step, which seemed a little odd to me, but it's part of the other ones, and frankly, I don't think it's a very important step. And Apple also provides an account recovery contact as part of this. So, you know, something terrible happens and you have set up a recovery contact, they can still get into your keys. So that's something you can set up through Apple, which is a handy feature. And then Windows Hello also offers support. They do not presently offer the synchronization, which is such a useful feature. But if you're running a browser on your Windows operating system, it can connect down to your Windows Hello, which manages your Windows authenticators, works in any browser on Windows. Also, interestingly, Microsoft Authenticator is FIDO2 based. Presently, I don't think Microsoft Authenticator and Windows Hello exactly match up in the same way that passkeys do, but it's a FIDO2 based authenticator, so there's the pieces there to kind of plumb them together and have a little more passkey type implementation. And the final piece of passkeys that's important is the cross-device authentication. So if you're on one device and you want to authenticate with another device, it's super easy. It just gives you a QR code. You can scan it with your mobile or laptop, potentially, whatever. And that provides a Bluetooth, which establishes a tunnel, and then the same authentication protocol that we talked about earlier just goes through that tunnel, which is cool. And we'll talk about this tunnel because there's some secret sauce going in there in the implementation. And you see I've got some screenshots here just showing you what the UI looks like. I guess one other thing that is worth mentioning is Google accounts turned on passkeys as authentication mechanism by default now. So if you have a Google account, you should be prompted to create a passkey now, which is great because they're really starting to push it out and sure everyone's using it. I've had it on my account for a while because it was previously opt-in, but now it's a default auth mechanism for Google accounts, which is great. So now that we've understand what passkeys are, let's look at how we can actually attack them. You know, not to let the cat out of the bag too much, but a lot of these attacks are not going to be easy to pull off, and there's no big secrets on how to actually hack passkeys in this talk. So the first one we talked about is the relaying party. So that is the ID that corresponds to the credential. If you can spoof the relaying party ID, you can potentially get an authenticated assertion for that site, which means you have a chance to actually log in and take over an account on that site. So this is probably the most interesting bit to attack if you want to potentially take over an account. It's easy to manipulate. If you got BurpSuite or you're otherwise in the middling traffic, you can just grab that field as we saw in the requests and manipulate it as you want. But that's not going to get you very far in most cases, because as the call goes into the FIDO system, the browser or the OS will actually validate the originating party. So in the browser context, that just ensures that your window origin matches the relaying party. If it doesn't, you're going to fail out. But there is one interesting wrinkle here, is how you match is not the same as how you match for the same origin policy. So same origin policy is, of course, your script loading, browser context definitions. So if you can bypass same origin policy, you've effectively got cross-site scripting. But how that matching is done is different for same origin policy as it is for passkeys. I think that's interesting, and I bet there will be some implementation bugs there somewhere along the way. So subdomains, or any registrable domain suffix, as they call it, is the most interesting bit here. So this means that subdomains are matched to equivalent domains. So mail.example.com is equivalent to auth.example.com is equivalent to example.com. So that creates some interesting opportunities, especially if you are able to achieve a subdomain takeover, and you can host code on that. You can then create authentication assertions for that site overall. One other interesting little bit is the matching does not include schemes or ports. So HTTP, HTTPS schemes, probably not that interesting, but I think ports are kind of interesting. So if you get into a scenario where you can potentially host something on a server on a different port and get a user there, that will match to the relaying party ID, and you can potentially get an assertion back. I've just got wildcards question marks up here. Wildcards exist in a bunch of that matching, and I haven't had a chance to play with it yet, but there's certainly some interesting things you can try there if you run into it in a pen test. Challenges. So challenges are the random strings. Obviously, it's what needs to be signed to show proof of the secret, which means this is kind of the key bit to creating an authentication assertion. So it has to be random, has to be generated on the server. It also has to be verified when the assertion comes back. But I think there's a couple other interesting use cases around reuse. So can you potentially replay? That should not be the case. You definitely shouldn't be able to replay. But is that properly implemented and properly checked? And then what about ordering and logic of challenges? So if you can fire off a bunch of requests to get a bunch of challenges, do the earlier ones expire? Are they still valid? Are there any interesting scenarios you can do there around timing to potentially get something? And then, of course, challenges need sufficient length and randomness so that they aren't predictable by the user. That's part of the spec and pretty straightforward. Cryptography. I think this is certainly going to be one of the interesting ways to attack passkeys. Cryptography is the strength of this authentication mechanism. There are pretty reliable security assurances that cryptography provides, which is how we know this is strong. Challenges are signed. One of the signing algorithms is RSA PKCS 1.5, which I want to mention in particular. This one is permitted, and in all the Passkey implementations I've looked at, has been enabled. Per RFCs, this should not be permitted anymore. And it's also the standard has been the cause of lots of implementation flaws relating to padding oracles and other things. So if this one's enabled, you're doing a pen test, I bet you'll find this. I think you're going to have a finding there. Of course, you got cryptography, so you've got the other cryptographic components there. You've got your random number generators that are going to be part of your authenticators, your credential creation, your crypto libraries, sort of vulns in existing crypto libraries, or potentially implementation-specific vulns around the crypto. And then there's actual algorithmic vulnerabilities. And anytime you're talking about attacking cryptography, you have to mention quantum, the crypto boogeyman. It's coming for you someday. We'll see. So then the other one is, or another one is script injection and cross-site scripting. I actually think this is the most viable attack vector to compromise an account that's protected with passkeys. So first of all, session attacks. If you can't compromise a passkey authentication results in a session, you can still go after sessions in any way that you presently would go after sessions, and that's probably an easier path. But if you are trying to attack the passkey and you have script loading on the relaying server or the browser, you've got script that controls it. There is a path where on passkey creation, you swap in the user's authenticator credential with an attacker credential. So they go through, they do the creation, but on the response, you see the challenge going in, so you have all the information you need to have your own little authenticator, which is loaded through your cross-site scripting. It does the full authentication process, but instead of returning the public key of the authenticator and the credentials that were created, it returns the attacker's public key. That way you've got long-lived credentials that are logged in and accessible for you to use anytime in the future to log into the account. I think this is probably about the only path to really break passkeys and get in there in a pen test that I've seen so far. There's one other kind of wrinkle here, which is interesting. Can you do that same sort of thing if the user's expecting to authenticate instead of create a passkey? Because the precondition to do it prior is they need to be creating a passkey so the attacker can overwrite the passkey with their own. But if the user is trying to authenticate, can you still do the passkey creation operation and the user just clicks through the UI, do your biometric authentication, all that sort of stuff, because they're expecting an authenticate, but they actually do a create. I've got two side-by-sides of what the UI looks like. It pops up on the bottom of your phone. It's definitely different. If the user's paying attention, you're not gonna get by them. But I bet some users would probably just click right through, and that might be viable. But information disclosure. There's a bunch of different ways to do some information disclosure related to passkeys and WebAuthN credentials. Mostly the information you're getting out of here isn't groundbreaking. It's nothing super interesting. So PII and user handle, we mentioned that earlier. The user handle is stored in the authenticator. So if you have a malicious relaying party that's loading scripts and discovering credentials, and you got PII in there, you can potentially discover usernames through the authenticator. So that's why you never want to have the PII as the user ID. There's some info discovery there. User enumeration, web server, similar techniques as you already see, logging into web servers. So account creation, account registration. If the web server returns an error or this account has already been created, that discloses information that the account already exists. So you get some user enumeration capabilities. The other one is that allow credentials field that we saw earlier, which specifies credentials that are permitted for that account to log in. In theory, this can disclose different types of credentials other than just your public key credential. So if you're in the process of migrating users from password-based authentication to passkey-based authentication, and you're doing it through the WebAuthN protocol, you might use this field to kick off a password login. And if a user can probe that and see that some accounts have password logins and some have passkey logins, that's useful information to attacker because they're going to attack the password-based accounts. You can also see different credential types, which you can potentially correlate to different authenticators. The length of credential IDs can give you hints as to what type of authenticators are used. Not very useful information, but it's something. And similarly, along the user enumeration vein, if your site uses the allow credentials field and they request credentials to log in with a user, and it doesn't provide an allow credentials and other users do, that gives you hints that that user account exists, so another user enumeration vector. Secret stealing. There's some real attacks here to definitely consider. Hardware attacks on USB authenticators. The keys are stored on the physical devices in the chips. They aren't used in that CTAP communication protocol either. They are stuck there. The signing happens on the chips. So you're not going to be able to sniff the USB. But if you want to go hardware, take it apart, desolder, you can potentially somehow get to that. I'm not super deep into the hardware side, but there definitely is some sort of a path there if you're a hardware reversing specialist. Cloud account recovery, we mentioned the methods that are used to protect it, but if you're able to get credentials, which may be password credentials still, for an Apple account or a Google account, that's half of what you need for the cloud account recovery. The other half is the device's passcode or passkey, so that's also obtainable. So you get those two pieces. That should work to get you the passkeys and the secret vault back, which is probably a usable attack path. And then the mobile or the internal authenticators as well. So if you have an authenticator that's on your device, you get RC on the device, escalate enough privileges, there's going to be a path to get there. Most of them you leverage some sort of trusted execution environment or trust zone hardware-based protection that's part of it. So it's pretty tough to get there, but there are exploit paths to do that. So that's also worth considering, especially if you've got RC on a box. Passkeys extensions. We mentioned that extensions are part of the protocol. The world of extension, there's more extensions can be built, but there are a few that are already defined and in limited use in some places. So there's some interesting attack paths here as well. One of them is user verification method. So this can actually specify what user verification method was used. It gets more granular. Previously we saw if users were verified, yes or no, but this will give you the actual method. So whether it was a fingerprint, a face print, an eye print, a passcode, whatever the specific method was. If you've implemented this extension and you care about that detail, it can be manipulated in the requests. So that's something you can tamper with. And if you implemented it and care about it, then there's probably a reason you care about it, which makes it potentially interesting and how you might be able to move on with that. App ID is another extension. It's basically how you can move older U2F keys and still use passkey authentication with them. So instead of specifying the RP ID in, well, you still do specify it in there, but you also specify it in the app ID extension. So this maps your RP ID to that when you're using the older style authenticators. So that's something you can look at. I don't see any immediate paths there, but it's interesting. Another one is large blob storage extension. So this allows opaque, potentially encrypted data storage to be stored with the credential. The use case I've heard of for this is certificates. So you can also have a secondary certificate which could be used in further authentication or encryption scenarios that's stored with that credential. So if you successfully authenticate, then you get access to that certificate. So that could potentially be, depending on how those certificates are used, I think there's a lot of interesting vectors there. And as, well, I'll mention in the next slide, that starts to build into larger authentication systems, kind of at an enterprise grade. You're looking at authentication federation, would potentially use that. So yeah, lots of interesting impacts there. One other feature of Passkeys is it allows device-bound credentials as well. So this means credentials have to always be on the same device, and it provides a public key to validate that it came from that same device. So that's provided in the extension field for Passkeys. So that's somewhere else that you can potentially attack, and it provides an additional assurance to the server that you can potentially go after. So here's one of the little secrets that I alluded to earlier. Bluetooth is used when you want to do the cross-device authentication. When it was created, it was intended to be a Bluetooth communication channel, so the communication happens locally. And one of the security assurances that provides is user presence. That means that the user is physically located with it close enough to the device to make a Bluetooth connection. So that ensures that they are physically at the authenticating device. What Google, well, first of all, this is not well documented. I found it on a podcast with Adam Langley from Google. There's a link to it there. But what Google has discovered is that the Bluetooth channel is not reliable. So what they have done is built a cloud tunnel where the actual communication handles. And they've got all kinds of wonderful crypto magic used to establish that tunnel. So the QR code that we saw earlier, that contains a public key and secret key. That gets scanned by your device and obviously is kept on the issuing party as well as it sends out a Bluetooth advert with a nonce in it and the cloud server. So the device, your authenticator, picks up the Bluetooth advert with the nonce in the cloud server. It gives you the cloud server address to connect to. It uses HKDF, which is a key derivation function, throws the advert in there, so to derive that key, you must have been within physical proximity to receive the Bluetooth advert. That's how it gets the physical proximity part of it, which drives the pre-shared key. Once you reach the cloud server, it uses a noise protocol, which is some really cool crypto, either NPPSK or KNPSK. Cool crypto stuff, provides end-to-end encryption and provable security for crypto. And then the laptop, of course, has the secret key as well as the PSK because they sent out the advert. So you now both have that pre-shared key. You have a secured tunnel established. But the attack surface here, I mean, there's a complicated handshake that's over-engineered with crypto. But if you can get into that private tunnel, you've potentially got a direct communication line to the authenticator where you can control everything and get authentication assertions back of your choice. So if you can break into that tunnel, you're going to have a really good time. The other bits that I think are also interesting are kind of the Passkey-related tangential pieces. So this is how they're going to be used in an enterprise context. As we do penetration tests, it's usually an enterprise we're pen testing. So you want to look at how you can leverage that and move out throughout the network. Presently, it's not really supported in authentication or in an enterprise context, but I feel like it will be in the future. Microsoft Entra, Azure AD, that is the interesting, or the place where I think there are still some more pieces of this to be developed. I mentioned Microsoft Authenticator uses FIDO2 standards already. You just see the pieces fitting together, although to my knowledge, they presently don't in a passkey context. So I think there could be some interesting bits there in the future. The other part is password managers. Google Password Manager is how it implements its syncing, iCloud backup through Apple, but other third-party password managers also support passkeys, so they need to expose APIs to allow for all those passkey-related functions. If they expose APIs that allow those passkey-related functions, why can an attacker abuse those same APIs? Permissions is the reason, but I think that's an interesting area that could have some attacks. And then the last piece of this talk is I've implemented a bunch of these checks in a BurpSuite plugin, which our pen testers are going to use for when we're assessing passkeys in the future. So as you might expect, it's BurpSuite extension. It passively monitors your network traffic. It detects WebAuthN transactions and then decodes them. It provides the decoded ones in the logs so you can look at it. I mentioned the authentication data, authenticator data object, which is CBOR encoded and really a pain to decode. This decodes that for you, drops it into logs so you can look at all those fields, as well as identifying misconfigurations within those individual fields. A few, basically we covered most of them in here, but a bunch of them can be automated, so that's what I've done. And this tool will be available soon, probably November 1st in the App Store. So the first one is the public key algorithms. So there's a whole list of public key algorithms that the relaying party will provide. It says which public key types will be supported. A bunch of those are not good choices. So the COAS algorithm registry provided by IANA has a list which includes recommendations and not recommendation. So we follow that, as well as there was a bunch that just aren't appropriate. Symmetric algorithms are also on this registry. Clearly a symmetric encryption algorithm is not going to work. So those will all get flagged as well. And yeah, I did want to mention RSA PKCS 1.5. I've got some CVs listed here. These are just recent vulns in various products due to that specification. They're padding oracles. There's always implementation flaws there, or not always, but there are regularly implementation flaws there. They've created tons of vulns, and these are recent CVEs. And all the passkeys that I've looked at so far have had this one enabled. So that's definitely going to be an issue. The other thing it does is when a credential is created, It decodes the credential and ensures that especially if it's elliptic curves, if all the points and curves are matching. So it ensures that the algorithm matches the type of curve that is defined, as well as checking the points encoding format conforms with the specification. The points in the curve, there's cryptographic attacks there. The point format, that's just conforming with specification. User verification. So this is more of a best practice finding. We mentioned the user verification field, if it's required, or it can also be preferred. Preferred is a reasonable option in some contexts. Preferred allows the authenticator platform to choose if user verification is required. That means most of the time it will ask for user verification, but if you're re-authenticating quickly after you just authenticated, it might not. The other kind of note there is if you're using like Windows Hello and you're providing a password to authenticate, that's a pain in the butt. That causes usability problems. So if you're expecting that type of authentication or user verification, maybe preferred is a more reasonable option for usability reasons. But the tool does raise a finding there, and you can decide if it's appropriate for your context. Challenge length, real simple inspection, just make sure the challenge is of sufficient length. 16 bytes is what the standard calls for, which is 128 bits. Most of the ones that you'll see will be 32 bytes, 256 bits. Allow credentials information disclosure. We talked about this. So the allow credential field specifies the types of credentials that are allowed. And if you see something other than a public key there, that gives you a hint that that account has credentials which can be attacked. Most of the time you're going to see a password there, or not see the password, see that password is the credential type. So that gives you a hint that's an account to attack. So if the scanner sees that, it'll raise a finding. And then the last one we've got is the user handle with PII. Again, this is an information disclosure vulnerability. Authenticators can disclose the user object during the credential discovery process. So if the user handle or user handle ID is your an email address or a user account name, that provides some user enumeration abilities. So we raise a finding if we see that. The scanner uses regex to match email address formats, so it only detects emails presently. But you should also be manually checking for usernames or other forms of PII. And that's it. Thanks very much for listening, and happy to field any questions. Yep.
So you mentioned, I think this is spoofing the relaying party. Currently, the attacks against NFA become more and more popular by using Jennings type of proxies.
Yep.
Would something like that work in this scenario?
You could do it. It would spoof the relaying party, but then as the authn API gets called, the browser checks it, so it will be caught there in most phases. So no, it probably wouldn't work unless you've got one of those other tricks with kind of the matching where it does like a match. But yeah. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Yeah, so with a Google account, if you have a passkey on your Google account and you lose your phone, how do you recover your Google account if you don't have any access to the passkeys to recover the passkeys?
Yeah, so it would be synced across your devices, so maybe you got a browser open, something like that. But then, yeah, there is that bootstrapping problem. Yeah, it's a good question.
You kind of need to keep the password.
Yeah, and Google presently is still keeping the password around for that scenario, but they want to get rid of it in the future. So yeah, it's interesting to think about and definitely still an issue. Anything else? Yeah.
Sorry, another question. So I think for Apple, you mentioned that there is a recovery mechanism where you can name another person
Yeah.
to be your recovery buddy, I guess.
Yeah.
Are there any options for offline recovery where you would say print out a bunch of, let's say, QR codes that you could put in a vault somewhere and use that?
No. Not that I know of. Yeah, I haven't seen anything about that. Anything else? Cool, thank you.